everyone. Yesterday we started talking about reproduction. We reviewed binary fission in our simple prokaryotes and mitosis in our simple single-celled eukaryotes like unicellular protists and fungi. We also talked about budding and fragmentation as forms of reproduction that some very simple animals can use and some plants can use. Um, Today, we're going to focus on animal reproduction, and we're also going to talk about how viruses reproduce. Now, I've talked a little bit about viruses already this semester when we discussed immunity. I want to remind you that viruses are not alive. They do not fit all of the 7 characteristics of life that we discussed. They don't grow, they're just manufactured inside of a cell. They're put together and they never change after that. A virus is also not able to reproduce on its own. It has to use a host cell. Again, that host cell is going to put it together kind of like a little machine. And that's how viruses come about. Now, viruses are very simple. There's only two parts to them. They're a protein coat, and they are either DNA or RNA on the inside. And usually they are DNA, but some of them do have RNA in them. Um, this protein coat is called the capsid. So if these are our viruses, this would be our capsid here. And the protein coat is going to have little markers on it called antigens. Now, antigens can bind to what we produce called antibodies. All right. So the virus has the antigen, we have the antibody. The antibody looks like a Y. It's got these little ends here that have a certain shape, and they can bind to an antigen or a protein marker on the outside of a virus or a bacteria. Now, antibodies can do a couple of different things. They can flag down a white blood cell and say, hey, I need you to come over here and destroy this pathogen. They can also clump bacteria or viruses together like you see here, so that a white blood cell can come in and consume the whole clump instead of trying to track down one pathogen at a time, which can be very time consuming. So it gets you better faster. Now, we do have something called vaccines. I mentioned those earlier. They stimulate the production of antibodies. So they're a form of active immunity because you make your own antibodies with vaccines. Um, and they will stimulate your body to produce the antibody because they're either a dead or weakened pathogen. So they're exposing you to the virus, and you might have a little side effect from the virus, but they will get you better quicker, and they'll prevent further infection. Viruses do mutate very quickly. It makes them very hard to treat. I mentioned Panama disease in the last lecture with the banana trees. We also have seen mutations in COVID-19. So that's another example of a fast mutating virus. There are two life cycles to viruses, the lytic and the lysogenic. Now, this one is more destructive, and this one has longer effects. So we're going to look at both of these. We'll start with the more damaging part of the virus reproductive cycle, the lytic phase. And this is when a virus injects its DNA or RNA into a cell. And this is an instruction manual that the cell is going to read. And once it reads it, the instruction manual tells the cell to stop doing its normal function, shut down normal activities, and focus on producing new virus. So the cell makes the proteins that the virus DNA encodes, and it generates new nucleic acids for the virus, and it starts to package those up inside of the cell. And the cell is going to get bigger and bigger as it's making new virus, and it's going to get more and more loaded with virus. So eventually it's going to pop, and all these viruses are going to be released, and they can go on and infect a new cell or even a new individual. So that is actually damaging the body. When you cough or sneeze, when you have a virus and you're getting that phlegm and mucus out of your body, most of that phlegm and mucus is cytoplasm from the cells that erupted that were infected with virus. So it's very important that you cover your face when you cough or sneeze because you're literally releasing virus particles into the air. The lysogenic phase is a longer lasting phase of the life cycle, but it doesn't cause as much immediate damage. So here, the virus is going to inject its DNA into the cell. And here we have the DNA of the virus incorporating itself into the DNA of the host. So you can see the red was the host DNA, the blue is the viral DNA. So now every time this cell reproduces, which is going to happen periodically, it's making new cells that also have this viral DNA. Now, eventually, something may happen to the environment, and it will cause this DNA to pop out and be read by the cell. And then we enter the lytic phase of the life cycle, and you actually show symptoms to the virus where you are producing new virus and those cells are being destroyed as they make it. So, two phases, both very dangerous. Most viruses do use both, some only use the lytic. But there are viruses that can hide in DNA for a very long time, like HIV has been known to hide up to, I think, 15 years before actually going into the lytic phase and showing symptoms. So this is a bigger picture of this. You can look at this as long as you want, but again, if you get a vaccine, it's going to stimulate your body to make the antibodies to fight against this pathogen. Exposure will do the same thing. Once you are exposed to a virus, your body will try to make the antibody for it. It takes a lot of energy to make this protein antibody, so that's why you get very tired when you are sick. Your body is pouring energy into making these proteins to help get you better. So we're going to move on to sexual reproduction in animals. Of course, we have our sperm with its flagella for swimming. We have our egg, which is much bigger, and this is fertilization. So sexual reproduction does require the joining of the sperm and the egg. And remember, sperm and egg are created during meiosis, where the chromosome number is cut in half. So this human sperm would deliver 23 chromosomes, and this human egg would deliver 23 chromosomes. So the purpose of meiosis is to make these chromosome numbers in the gametes correct, so that when those gametes come together, the zygote will have the right number of genes and the right number of chromosomes. 46 for humans. Now, some animals can reproduce sexually and asexually. Like there are certain insects that can do this. Bees, for example, can reproduce either way. The fertilized eggs, I think, become the females, and the non-fertilized eggs become the male workers. So there are two types of sexual reproduction in animals. You have external fertilization and internal fertilization, and they're exactly what they sound like. External fertilization, the egg and sperm come together outside of the body, and internal fertilization, the egg and sperm come together inside of the body. External fertilization was probably first to evolve because it is mostly used in the water. Now, keep in mind that sperm do have a flagella for swimming, so that indicates that that trait has been passed down through evolutionary lines for a very long time because all animals have it. Including those that live in the water. So our very primitive aquatic animals, like our aquatic invertebrates, our water bugs, for example, amphibians, salamanders, and frogs, and then fish, all of these use external fertilization, like spawning, where the egg and the sperm is going to be released and then they can come together. Now, these sperm and egg do use chemical signals to find each other in the water. And also, there are chemical signals that are produced when organisms are ready to mate. So we call those chemical signals pheromones, and we talked about those a little bit already. These encourage organisms to come closer together for mating. Pheromones can also be used to help things find food, like ants, for example, leave trails of pheromones to get to lead the colony to a food source. Now, the advantage of external fertilization is that you can produce a lot of offspring. You lay a lot of eggs at one time, and there's a cloud of sperm to fertilize them. And this large amount of offspring is going to help to increase the survival of the species. You just produce so many organisms that the environment's basically flooded with them. So some of them will survive to carry on the line. But there will be a lot of competition, and many organisms will die early on. So here's a few organisms that do reproduce externally. We mentioned that fish reproduce externally. Now I have a video in here of fish reproduction. So when you look at the slides, you can play that and see the fish spawning. We also have frogs, and you can see here, this is the female. She's bigger than the male. He's clasping onto her. They do not use internal fertilization. So she's laying her eggs in a clutch. And once these eggs are laid, he will release a cloud of sperm very close and nearby to wash over those eggs. And then they will be fertilized and you can get your tadpoles. So this is the video of fish spawning when you have a chance. I'm not going to show it here, but you can watch it yourself on your slide set. When organisms started moving onto land, there wasn't a watery environment for that sperm to swim through. So internal fertilization evolved in primitive lines like insects. So this gave direct delivery of sperm to the egg. Now the sperm does still have a watery environment inside of the female that it can swim through. So we do retain that flagella. but we see insects using sexual reproduction that is internal, birds, reptiles, mammals, all of these land-dwelling things. There are a few aquatic animals that use internal fertilization. Sharks, one of the few fish that use internal fertilization. Lobsters, aquatic mammals, because all aquatic mammals had a terrestrial ancestor. And there are some things in the water that don't move that you would think would use external fertilization since they can't get around and find a mate. But barnacles even use internal fertilization because they evolved from crabs. So anyway, internal fertilization does require a specialized sex organ to transfer sperm from male to female, and that sperm has that watery environment inside of the female to swim through. Now, just because an egg is fertilized inside of the body does not mean it has to develop there. So we have two forms of development, external and internal. And lots of things that use internal fertilization still lay their eggs, like turtles, a lot of insects, and many other reptiles. And these eggs are often laid on the land. You see the sea turtle digging a little hole for its eggs here. And if you ever see sea turtles hatching, and oftentimes the birds are there trying to get the sea turtles before they can make it to the water. I know you want to, but don't pick the sea turtles up and carry them. They actually develop all of their swim muscles in that little walk between their nest and the ocean. So if you pick a sea turtle up and carry it to the ocean, it won't have its muscles and it would actually die. So the egg that is laid on land is what we call an amniotic egg, and it was super important for terrestrial organisms. Now, eggs that are laid in the water we saw earlier this year do not dehydrate because water will move from a high to a low concentration. So it will go into the egg and keep that egg hydrated. But eggs laid on land will dry out if they do not have a shell around them. We saw that with our egg in the air. It started to slowly evaporate, losing about a gram a day. So the egg is going to contain the food for the embryo and a nice shell, either a leathery shell or a hard shell, something that's going to keep this egg from drying out. And that's what we mean by an amniotic egg. It won't dehydrate because it's laid on land. Super important adaptation for terrestrial organisms. Other organisms use internal development, so there's no trouble with the egg drying out. It's kept inside the female's body. So that's still an amniotic egg. There is a method for it to stay hydrated. Now, there are some organisms that have the egg in their body, and the egg will literally hatch and the baby will be born. That's what happens to these snakes, like you see this rattlesnake giving live birth here. Other organisms, the egg doesn't actually hatch, it just starts to divide and it will develop into an embryo. So that is what we see with mammals. Mammals all use internal fertilization. And some mammals, like your monotremes, your platypus, for example, will lay eggs. But those are the only mammals that really lay eggs. Other mammals are divided into two groups, either placental or marsupial. And again, we have the monotremes that lay eggs. Marsupials are your mammals with a pouch. So they do use internal fertilization and internal development. And the baby is born, and then it will crawl from the womb to the pouch. So once this kangaroo is born, it's a tiny little pink worm-looking thing, and it's going to crawl from the vagina up to the pouch. And it's going to crawl in there, and it will have its milk and things that it needs to develop. Possums, same thing. You see the possum with its little pouch full of its babies here. And this is someone's pet possum. I've heard that they make good pets. The possum is the only marsupial native to the North America. Most marsupials, 90% of them, reside in Australia. Not all of them, but most of them. Placental mammals do not have a pouch. The baby is just going to develop inside of the body and it will be born in an amniotic sac. So placental mammals actually grow a new organ in the body when they're pregnant. So when the egg and the sperm come together, you get your zygote, and that zygote has all the information for the developing embryo and the information to make the placenta that embryo is going to stay in while it's in the womb. This placental mammals take up 90% of mammals on the planet. That's most of them. And this is the placenta here, and it's going to develop in the uterus while the female is pregnant. Once the female gives birth, this is the amniotic sac the baby's going to be in up to the point where until it's ready to be born. And the mother will give birth to the embryo, and also the placenta comes out as well. You can see the umbilical cord here. This attaches the baby to the placenta, which is fed nutrients and water and oxygen and things from the mother's body via this umbilical cord. We'll touch on fungal reproduction here for just a minute. So fungi can be either uni or multicellular. We have an example here of a unicellular yeast, and it's reproducing by budding. So it's growing a little organism off the side of its body. You can see there's 4 of them here, 4 buds that are developing. So the yeast is copying its DNA and passing this on to the bud. And it will grow off the side of the yeast until it's mature, and then it'll break away and live on its own. So that's an example of unicellular fungal reproduction and asexual reproduction. But most fungi use sexual reproduction, and they grow a mushroom. So here you see the underside of one particular type of mushroom, and these are called gills, not like gills that fish breathe through, but these are fungus gills. So this is where the spores will be kept. Remember how spores work? They are haploid, they are unicellular. So once they are released, they will go and grow somewhere by mitosis, and you will get a new fungus. This fungus, when it's ready to reproduce sexually, will produce eggs and sperm that will come together and give you a brief little zygote that will grow into a mushroom. And that mushroom will go through meiosis and develop the spores, which can then be dropped somewhere and hopefully grow somewhere favorable. Fungi are very, very difficult for humans to control. Um, they're one of the hardest pathogens for us to deal with. We'll do a quick summary on the advantages and disadvantages of asexual reproduction here. Advantages, it does not require a partner, so there's only one parent passing on the DNA, and that makes it very fast. You can produce a lot of organisms very quickly. E. coli, for example, can reproduce every 20 minutes because there's no partner needed. The offspring are going to be identical, which makes asexual reproduction great for a stable environment that doesn't change. Those organisms are well adapted to that environment, and so they will do quite well there. However, the disadvantage is that those organisms are identical, and that will not work in a changing environment that has some negative effect on those organisms. For example, when our anaerobic prokaryotes evolved first on the planet, later photosynthesis evolved, and all that oxygen, remember, poisoned a lot of our anaerobic prokaryotes. When the environment changed, there was a big extinction in the prokaryotes because they couldn't handle it. We also talked about the banana trees, how they're all clones of each other. And if Panama disease gets into a banana crop, it'll kill them all because they're all identical. The DNA is all the same, and that makes the organism susceptible to the same problems. We'll also look at the advantages and disadvantages of sexual reproduction quickly. The advantages are that you have that exchange between partners, and so you have varied organisms, and that means the population or the species is more likely to survive if the environment changes. You have a chance that there is an organism out there that's going to be tolerant to that change and can pass on those traits. The disadvantage is that it does take 2 parents to exchange that DNA, and so it is slower and produces fewer offspring. So you can think about your organisms that use sexual reproduction actually do take more time to reproduce. And that's all we have for reproduction. So hopefully that was a good little review and extension of what we've already talked about. And if you have any questions, then please contact me. Have a great day, and don't forget to take your quiz.